Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our continuing series of webinars featuring various engineers that help us out here at AE 911 Truth. I'm Andy Steele, the operations manager, and tonight we're going to be hearing from Larry Cooper on the Twin Towers. Now, if you're not familiar with Larry, you should be. He's done a lot of great work here for us at this organization and for the 911 Truth movement. He received his a degree in civil engineering from the University of Wisconsin in 1967 and a master's in structural engineering from the University of Illinois in 1970. As a registered professional and structural engineer in several states during his nearly 50-year career in consulting engineering, he was involved in designing, constructing, and inspecting bridges, wastewater treatment facilities, and industrial structures, as well as managing structural design and transportation engineering groups. He was also active in the American Society of Civil Engineers and the American Council of Engineering Companies. Larry is a member of the ASCE and the Structural Engineers Association of Michigan. As well, he is a board member here at AE 911 Truth, and he's a volunteer for project due diligence, which is getting presentations like these in front of professional organization branches all over this country. So a lot of great work being done by him and by so many people. Now, I just want to say a few things before we get started. First of all, you can submit questions. I haven't said this in the last few webinars. It's sort of implied, but you can submit questions to us, which we're going to take at the end of this webinar. Best way to do it is go to the YouTube chat and write question in the chat box. I'll see it better that way. And write your question there, or you can put it up on Facebook as well. Also, if you're an engineer and you want to get credit for viewing this presentation, all you have to do is simply write to us at cpd@ae911truth.org, and you just got to request your credit. You got to tell us what your biggest takeaway is from this presentation, and also provide your name and just affirm that you are an engineer, and we will be giving you credit for watching this. So now that all that is out of the way, I'm going to disappear and give the floor to Larry. Larry, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Andy, especially for hosting this series of webinars. It's always a pleasure working with you to get the truth out on an issue so critically important for everyone to understand. This is part 2 of our critiquing of the reports prepared by the National Institute of Standards and Technology on what caused the Twin Towers to collapse on September 11th of 2001. Part 1, critiquing Nist report on Building 7, was delivered last week by our President and CEO, Roland Engel, and can be found on our website. For the record, Nist is part of the U.S. Commerce Department, which is part of the executive branch of the U.S. government. Nist began its investigation in August of 2002, 11 months after 9/11, and released its 10,000-page report on the Twin Towers 3 years later in October of 2005. The towers were 110 stories tall. The items that we're going to be discussing tonight are the background of buildings 1 and 2, aircraft impacts and damage, the Nist column failure theory and collapse hypothesis, evidence of core column failure occurring first, ASCE's published progressive collapse theory, an analysis of ASCE's progressive collapse theory, the South Tower collapse symmetry anomaly, other high-rise fires, destruction of evidence, summary of problems with the Nist World Trade Center Tower report, and deficiency categories in the Nist World Trade Center reports and ASCE published theories. These high-rise structures were designed using the tube structure system, whereby the perimeter columns resisted the lateral loads, primarily wind and seismic, and the core and perimeter columns carried gravity loads. In this floor plan, north is upward in both structures. There are 60-foot long floor trusses running in a north-south direction, spanning between the north and south sidewalls and the core area, and 36-foot floor trusses spanning between the east and west sidewalls and the core area. The picture on the right shows the core columns, and on the left, the three perimeter columns, the three perimeter columns are shown on the right. The spandrel beams and floor trusses run across the picture. This was a picture taken during construction. The column cross-sections in the interior core varied from massive multi-plate sections in the lower levels to 14-inch wide-flange sections in the upper levels. 12 different grades of steel were used between the lower and upper levels of the interior and exterior columns. The first plane hit the north face of Building 1 near the 95th floor at 8:46 a.m., and the building collapsed 1 hour and 42 minutes later. The second plane hit the south face of Building 2 at 9:03 above the 77th floor, and the building collapsed 56 minutes later. This is an elevation view of the plane hitting the North Tower. The greatest impact on the building came from the fuselage and the engines. Engines being represented here by these yellow circles here, and of course that being the fuselage area. Now, listen to what a FEMA structural engineer had to say 15 years before 9/11 about how much damage a 3-ton aircraft flying into a building designed to resist 13,000 tons of wind load could do.
The fact that they were designed to resist over 13,000 tons of wind pressure meant that they could not be knocked over. In a remarkably prescient interview given over 15 years ago, Charlie Thornton, now one of the investigators, considered the scenario.
Well, 13,000 tons is a lot of force. People always talk about an airplane crashing into a building. And in 1944 or 45, a plane did crash into the Empire State Building. But the largest aircraft flying today, at least commercially, the 747, fully loaded, is on the order of 300 tons. So if you think about a 300-ton element crashing into a building that's been designed to carry 13,000 tons, you can see that an aircraft crashing into the World Trade Center would probably not do anything to the major building. It could affect localized structural elements, could knock out a column, and there could be some damage. But as far as a plane knocking a building over of that type, that would not happen.
Since the Empire State accident had shown that a plane could crash into a New York skyscraper, the designers were forced to consider.
Here's what the Twin Towers structural engineer John Skilling had to say 8 years before 9/11. Skilling noted that he designed the World Trade Center tower to take a hit from a Boeing 707. Asked in 1993 if he had considered plane crashes in his design, he replied, "Our analysis indicated the biggest problem would be the fact that all the fuel would dump into the building, but the building structure would still be there." Nist stated that the robustness of the perimeter frame tube system and the large size of the buildings helped the towers withstand the impact. The structural system redistributed loads without collapsing in places of aircraft impact. The towers withstood the initial impact of the aircraft. The buildings had more than 1,000 times the mass of the aircraft. This ability to withstand the initial impact is hardly surprising. Now listen to Nist's explanation of how the structural loads got distributed around the damaged columns.
What happened was that the loads that were being carried by those columns arched across the opening.
The aircraft impact analysis showed that the wings were shredded before they hit the central core. The Nist report rendered views of impact damage to the affected floors of the North Tower, with the 95th and 96th floors being most severely impacted. Nist did not show a damage view of the 98th floor, where they admit the collapse initiated. In the Nist report, they had an isometric view of calculated damage to the central core of the North Tower. FEMA estimated the dispersion of the jet fuel on floors 92 through 99 and concluded that the resulting fires had an insignificant impact on the structural system. Now let's review why aircraft impact and jet fuel would not have caused collapse. Wings would not have made it to the central core. Most of the fuel was aerosolized on impact, with much of it remaining outside the building. The fuel which did enter the building burned up within minutes. The redundant steel frame redistributes loads. The factor of safety against vertical impact for the perimeter columns was 5-1, and for the core columns was 3-1. This is far too high for the impact damage to approximately 20% of the columns to have caused collapse. Nist postulates that exterior columns were pulled inward by heated and sagging floor trusses, causing them to buckle and initiate the global collapse. The report claims this happened on the south face of the North Tower and the east face of the South Tower. The south face of the North Tower was the side opposite the side of the building hit by the plane. The east face of the South Tower is the face hit by the plane. As we will see later, Nist ignored the documented evidence that the interior core columns began collapsing before the exterior columns. But instead of starting with that sequence, Nist based its analysis on the assumption that the floor trusses sagged enough to pull on the wall columns. They subjected a truss model to exceptionally high temperatures in an attempt to attribute the inward movement from the columns to sagging, overheated floor trusses. The Nist model could not produce an inward force from sagging floor trusses, which would pull the columns inward. And this is the 60-foot floor trusses depicted here, and the 36-footers in the short end. So where did Nist find the additional lateral load needed to create the necessary lateral forces on the columns? To produce the inward bowing of the columns, an artificial 5,000-pound lateral load was applied at each truss to column connection at each story in the impact zone. If you did this on your SE or PE exam, do you think you would have been certified? Nist further emphasized the artificial forces with this diagram without any supporting evidence. Using the forces just described, Nist produced this displacement pattern in the south face of Building 1. Here's the Nist report explanation for collapse initiation and propagation of the North Tower. With the continually increased bowing as more columns buckled, the entire width of the south wall buckled. Instability started at the center of the south wall and rapidly progressed horizontally toward the sides. As a result of the buckling of the south wall significantly unloaded, redistributing its load to the softened core through the hat truss and to the east and west walls through the spandrels. 2 minutes before the collapse, the north, east, and west walls of floor 98 carried about 7, 35, and 30% more gravity loads than they did right after the impact, and the south wall carried about 7% and the core 20% less loads. The section above the impact zone tilted to the south as column instability progressed rapidly from the south wall to the east and west walls, resulting in increased gravity load on the core columns. The release of potential energy due to downward movement of the building mass above the buckled columns exceeded the strain energy that could be absorbed by the structure. Global collapse ensued. That's Nist's statement. Now let's review a few problems with the Nist report explanation for collapse initiation and propagation. There is no evidence or basis for the claim that sagging trusses could pull in the south wall of the North Tower. The Nist model did not generate the loads on the south wall columns needed to pull them inward. The Nist applied artificial loads to the columns with the claim that it was necessary to match the photographic evidence. With a factor of safety of 5, the load increase to the east and west walls of 35% and 30% respectively would only increase the demand on those columns to about 27% of their capacity. So there is no reason to expect them to fail. Nist simply assumes a horizontal propagation across the building. Nist simply assumes global vertical collapse would ensue, and then relies on a paper by Professor Bazant for an explanation of vertical collapse propagation. The video evidence shows that the core columns are what actually collapsed first. As mentioned earlier, video evidence shows that the interior core columns began coming down before the exterior columns. Look closely at the antenna, which is supported by the core columns, as it starts falling before the building perimeter starts coming down.
When the collapse finally starts, the antenna started just a little bit before the exterior of the building started, and that tells us that the core columns let go first.
Now watch frame by frame as the antenna begins dropping before the building walls begin dropping. 1, 2. Okay, so the core column failure occurred first. This comes from FEMA in 2002. The transmission tower on top of the structure began to move downward and laterally slightly before movement was evidenced at the exterior wall. This suggests that the collapse began with one or more failures in the central core area of the building. The hat truss supported the antenna on the north tower, and the core columns supported the hat truss. The hat truss served to transfer vertical and horizontal and lateral loads between the perimeter columns and the core columns. The core columns shown here in brown were supporting the hat truss. So what both the video evidence and the FEMA analysis indicate is that first the core columns fail, then the hat truss and antenna descend before the perimeter columns, then the core columns pull on the floor trusses. Finally, the floor trusses pull in the perimeter columns, initiating complete collapse. In this next video, watch closely at the east wall, the wall on the left side of this video. And notice the walls being pulled in. See it a couple of times, okay? This next video illustrates how the floor trusses spanning between the walls and the interior core pulled the walls in as the core columns descended. The center core in brown on the right is collapsing, and of course through the floor trusses pulling the exterior walls inward. So how did the progressive collapse theory get started and perpetuated thereafter? Civil engineering professor Besant submitted the progressive collapse theory to the ASCE on September 13th of 2001, just 2 days after the attack. The ASCE published the theory in the article titled "Why Did the World Trade Center Collapse? Simple Analysis" by Besant and Zoe in the Journal of Engineering Mechanics in January of 2002. Besant claimed a large dynamic load would have occurred, caused by what he termed a powerful jolt, and that it would overcome the reserve strength of the columns below. After various questions were raised about the theory, Besant and Lee defended it in the article titled "What Did and Did Not Cause Collapse of World Trade Center Towers in New York," published in the journal in 2008. So here's a brief description of the progressive collapse theory. Besant used an energy analysis to construct it, and his mathematical model is described below, whereby he claimed that the kinetic energy of the upper portion of the building, when it fell onto the lower portion of the building, was greater than the sum of the resistance of the buckling columns that failed in the collapse initiation zone, plus the inertial resistance of the structure in the building below the initiation zone, plus the structural resistance of the columns in the building below the initiation zone. So in the mathematical model, he's saying E1 exceeded the sum of those, where E1 is the kinetic energy of the falling upper part of the building, 2 is the sum of resistance to buckling of columns in the initiation zone, 3 is the conservation of momentum of the upper story of the lower part being hit by the falling upper part, and 4 is the sum of resistance to collapse of columns in the lower part. There's a bit of a problem. Besant's progressive collapse theory violates Newton's third law of motion. In 2008, David Chandler, a high school physics teacher, measured the Building 1 roofline acceleration, showing that there was no significant change in acceleration of the collapsing roofline, thereby indicating that the falling upper section did not encounter any change in resistance as it encountered the lower building structure. So, continuing with the evolution of the progressive collapse theory, McQueen and Zambodi published an article titled "The Missing Jolt, a Simple Refutation of the Nist-Bazant Collapse Hypothesis," on the website of the Journal of 9/11 Studies in 2009. David Chandler published an article titled "Destruction of the World Trade Center North Tower and Fundamental Physics" on that website in 2010. Bazant and Lee defended the theory again in a paper titled "Why the Observed Motion History of the World Trade Center Towers is Smooth," published in the Journal of Engineering Mechanics in January of 2011. Zambodi and Johns submitted a discussion paper in May of 2011 to the JME, pointing out errors in the Bazant and Lee paper titled "Why the Observed Motion History of the World Trade Center Towers is Smooth." 1 year later, in May of 2012, Zambodi and Johns were notified by the JME that their discussion paper was rejected on the basis of just one reviewer's comments. Zambodi and Johns immediately responded to the rejection with a rebuttal, showing that the rejection was unjustified as the reviewer was wrong on almost all points. The journal editors responded by agreeing to publish the discussion paper after an editorial review. Another year passed with no action on the part of the journal editors. Zambodi and Johns sent a letter to JME in May of 2013 inquiring about the status of their discussion paper. Then, 3 months later, in August, the JME chief editors responded that the discussion paper was out of scope and would not be published. While the above was occurring, Zambodi and Johns joined with Zuladinsky, and I apologize if I didn't pronounce the name correctly, in writing a full technical note addressing all four of the Bazant World Trade Center papers that the JME had published. It was submitted to the JME in May of 2012 and was rejected by them after a few months as being out of scope, with no further explanation. It was then submitted to the International Journal of Protective Structures, where it was published in June of 2013. Okay, let's take a look at the values that Bazant used in his energy equation. E1, the maximum design load was used for the mass of the upper part of the building above the initiation zone. And it was nearly twice the actual in-service load shown in published reports. He used 54 million kilograms versus the actual 33 million kilograms. A velocity after a fall of 1 story due to gravitational acceleration of 8.5 meters per second was used, while the actual measurements show it to be 6.1 meters per second. The velocity is squared in the kinetic energy equation, and this doubles the contribution. Due to his nearly doubling the mass and velocity contributions to the kinetic energy, E1 was too high by a factor of almost 4. All right, let's look at E2. The fall through the initiation zone did not account for buckling resistance, which he eliminated completely. Thus, E2 was reduced to 0. E3, the conservation of momentum calculation, only used a 627,000 kilogram mass for the story below, or about 14% of the 3.87 million kilogram mass he used for the stories in his 14-story, 54 million kilogram upper section. Thus, E3 was too low by a factor of 7. E4, the estimate of the resistance of the columns in the lower part of the building was only about 31% of what it actually can be shown to be. Thus, E4 was too low by a factor of 3. So, after correcting these miscalculations, we therefore have to conclude that E1 is far less than the sum of E2, 3, and 4, and progressive collapse will not occur. The actual falling energy versus energy absorbing of the resisting elements is graphically represented here. So, how can the gravitational collapse of 12 stories of a steel-framed building with the entire framing system bolted together turn most of those stories into dust and propel building components laterally hundreds of feet? Much of the materials landed outside the building's footprint. So watch as most of the top 12 stories appear to encounter no resistance and fall freely into the lower structure. Okay, it just kind of vanishes. So, in this next video, note the smoke coming out evenly on the side and front of the building as the collapse initiates at the 98th floor. You'll see it occurring right in this zone. All of a sudden, a lot of smoke blowing out and flames. Now let's look at the South Tower collapse symmetry anomalies. Here is the South Tower at the onset of collapse. The collapse is advancing evenly and progressing in a straight line around the building. So how could a symmetrical progression occur due to asymmetrical damage? Other high-rise fires have occurred over the decades, and here's a brief look at 3 steel-framed high-rise buildings subjected to intense fires but did not collapse. Here's a few comments on the destruction of the evidence. Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of the Fire Engineering magazine, demands a stop to destruction of evidence. The structural steel from the World Trade Center has been and continues to be cut up and sold for scrap. Such destruction of evidence shows the astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. Now listen to Dr. Corley being questioned by a congressman.
When did you become aware that the steel from the World Trade Center was being sold off?
I think it was on the order of a week or so before we arrived on site on October the 5th, I believe.
So in other words, the city was selling or was disposing of a material within 2 weeks of the actual event?
I believe I was the first one to find out that the steel is being recycled. New York Times reporter Jim Glantz told me 2 weeks after the collapse, and I tried to contact city and also New York Times reporters tried to make sure we can have access to steel to do the research. It was not happening.
I just think there's so much that has been lost in these last 6 months that we can never go back and retrieve. And it's not only unfortunate, it's borderline criminal.
400 truckloads per day of material were taken away from the World Trade Center site and sent to China for recycling.
There were laws violated in the destruction of that evidence. And for the American Society of Civil Engineers to ignore those events is extremely disturbing and is a violation, in my opinion, of their professional code of ethics.
It was contrary to the way all investigations are done. If an airplane crashes, they seal off the entire area and nobody touches anything. They move it to a secure location and they reconstruct an aircraft.
Normally, when you have a structural failure, you carefully go through the debris field, looking at each item, photographing every beam as it collapsed and every column where it is in the ground, and you pick them up very carefully and you look at each element. We were unable to do that in the case of Tower 7.
You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. And the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science. It's trying to prove preconceived ideas.
John Gross of Nist was in the salvage yards deciding what materials to save for further analysis. Nist only saved between 0.25% and 0.5% of the steel from the Twin Towers and only one small piece from Building 7. Out of the steel Nist did save, testing showed only 3 pieces had experienced temperatures above 250 degrees centigrade and none above 600 degrees centigrade. When confronted about the lack of high steel temperatures evidence, Nist claimed that there was not a big enough sample to draw conclusions. The hotspots in the World Trade Center rubble corroborates reports of deep down molten metal. This USGS aerial photo taken on September 16, just 5 days after the event, shows surface temperatures as high as 1,377 degrees. The official reports by NIST, FEMA, and the 9/11 Commission, however, omit any mention of the large quantities of molten metal observed in the basement areas of the Twin Towers and Building 7. So, let's review a summary of the problems with the NIST report. 1, the claim that the upper part of the towers crushed the lower part of the towers violates the laws of conservation of momentum and the law that for every action between bodies there is an equal and opposite reaction, as shown by the measured, smooth, uninterrupted descent of the upper portion of the North Tower. NIST claims that the floor trusses in the aircraft impact zone push outward on the perimeter columns with a force of about 80 kips before starting to sag and pull the columns inward to cause the buildings to collapse. Yet, there is no evidence to support this claim. Extensive photos and videos of the towers show no outward bowing of the perimeter columns at any time during the fires before the collapse. Nist imposed unrealistic, artificial 5-kip loads on each floor truss to column connection over the 5 stories of the damage area on the south face of the North Tower in order to make their collapse initiation model work. This amounts to a lateral force of about 750 kips applied artificially to that face of the building, which cannot be justified by any rationale. Nist does not investigate or explain the global collapse which occurred after the collapse initiation was supposedly initiated by the column failures in the impact zone. Nist simply states global collapse ensued. The Nist collapse sequence is initiated by the failure of the floor trusses in the impact zone and subsequent pulling in of the perimeter columns. But this sequence ignores the fact that the core columns failed first, as evidenced by the video of the North Tower collapse, showing that the antenna and head truss resting on the core columns began their descent well before the outer perimeter of the building began to fail. This fact invalidates the Nist collapse initiation theory. The Nist report fails to provide any information suggesting that the load capacity of the core and perimeter columns was exceeded at any time during the collapse sequence. Nist ignored the fact that the factor of safety of 3 in the core columns and 5 in the perimeter columns would have prevented the failure mechanism that is theorized in their collapse initiation model. The Nist global collapse theory depends upon the ASCE-published progressive collapse theory by Besant. His theory has been shown to have erroneous input data, rendering it non-viable as an explanation for the observed behavior of the vertical propagation. ASCE refuses to acknowledge the errors in the input data of Besant's theory. Now let's review deficiency categories in the reports and ASCE's published theories. First, defective collapse initiation theories in the Nist Twin Tower and Building 7 reports. Second, unjustified assumptions and errors in their reports. Omissions and alterations of construction details in the Building 7 report, which was presented last week. Errors in the calculations of the ASCE published theories. Internal contradictions in the Building 7 reports, again, which was pointed out last week. Nist ignores FEMA evidence of high temperature exposure of structural steel from Building 7. Nist and the ASCE refused to respond to peer criticism. So, this information presents engineers with the opportunity to join architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth and the call for a new investigation. What can you do? Sign our petition for a new investigation. Disseminate this information to engineering colleagues. Donate to architects and engineers to help reach as many engineers as possible with this information. Urge any engineering organization to which you belong to call for a new investigation. Become a volunteer presenter for Project Due Diligence, as I am doing right now, to help deliver this information to local engineering organizations. So, what would that new investigation look like? Here's what we recommend. 1, formal AE 9/11 Truth participation. A panel composed of civil, structural, fire protection, mechanical engineers, physicists, chemists, and demolition experts. Panel members vetted to have no conflict of interest. A staff to prepare documents and keep records. Subpoena power. Adequate funding. A reasonable timeline to investigate and prepare a peer-reviewed report. The report is to be released and broadly disseminated to the public. Okay. So, I want to thank you all for your attention and interest in this matter. Our profession owes the public a thorough investigation that informs us of the true cause of collapse of these 3 buildings, the most consequential collapses to ever have occurred. We must engage in this matter if we expect the public to trust our profession. I'll be happy to entertain your questions and comments. Turn it back to Andy.
All right, Larry, thank you so much. And just want a quick reminder to any engineers out there, if you want to get credit for viewing this presentation, write to cpd@ae911truth.org. Request your credit, tell us who you are, verify you're an engineer, and tell us what you took away from this presentation. That's all we ask for. So let's get started with our questions. We're going to go with 4 of them today. First one says, now this is from somebody that sounds a little skeptical of what we're presenting here. He says, so how many people would need to be involved placing explosives in the 3 buildings, and everybody's keeping quiet about it? Is that what you're saying? With a couple of question marks to show the disdain there. So I may have something to say on this, but go ahead, Larry.
Yeah, well, it would take a significant number of people, and it would take a significant amount of time, I think, based on what I have heard about other controlled demolition projects. Yes, it probably would have taken weeks to install demolition charges in these buildings.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's asking us to get into speculation for things that we can't know when they did it, exactly where they put things, and that's not what we're doing. What we're showing you is that the official story is wrong. It is absolutely wrong. So at the very least, even if you don't like what we're saying here, it justifies a rerunning of the analysis. If you watched John Cole's presentation during our 21st anniversary event last Friday, he had a great analysis regarding the top block coming down and the spire, so you should check that out. So if Nist is getting things wrong in their analysis, considering that thousands of people died in this event, at the very least it justifies a new analysis, a new investigation. We talk about certain things being silver bullets to the official story. In the case of, I believe it's the North Tower, where they say the collapse initiated on the 98th floor, only the tip of the airplane's wing touched that floor. And they admit right in their report that they need the fireproofing knocked off there in order for their collapse initiation hypothesis to happen. So right there, because of those anomalies, those 2 facts that don't match up, they should rerun the analysis. Simple as that. Our next question says, why hasn't AE 9/11 Truth attempted to recreate the aircraft hitting the WTC in similar fashion to vehicle crash testing, run a similar site, salvage aircraft into a mock-up sect of the World Trade Center? Imagine that'd be extremely difficult. What do you think, Larry?
Well, yeah, if somebody would come up with the funding for that, I'm sure we'd be happy to do that.
Well, the thing is, you can't really recreate the exact same circumstances. I mean, because even with scale models and such, because you got the tallest buildings in the world at the time, and then you have airplanes hitting them at the exact same place as well. Most of our analysis is about what happens after the airplanes hit, and that's really what we are disputing there, is the physics and everything that Nist says happened in those buildings. Now, the next one is from a debunker that's been assigned to us, and he's spamming us. He wants us to answer these with yes or no, but we're not his witnesses in a trial here, so we're going to elaborate, and we're going to just take two of them. The first one says, the idea given by some truthers is that material was shipped directly from ground zero to China, not via the Fresh Kills site or Claremont salvage yard. Do you think any went straight to China?
I have no idea, and I don't think that's really relevant in the analysis that we're doing here. Because that gets into what happened outside the buildings. I mean, what we're focused on is the science that explains the cause of the buildings to collapse. That's our primary focus. When it go beyond that, that's a whole different investigation.
Right, and it's sort of a distractionary question because we have a picture of John Gross there posing next to chemically damaged steel when he's denying any evidence of high temperatures. I don't know if we had that video in this presentation, but right there's another contradiction. He's denying evidence of high temperatures in the world at the site and the steel, and there he is posing next to it in his blue jeans and hard hat. So big problem there. Next one says, do you or your friends ever use the words explosion, exploded, exploding, blast figuratively to refer to things other than the use of explosive devices? So they're going after the accounts of explosions there that day.
I think there is, yes, if you look at the reports by firefighters, if you look at reports of people who are on site, people who have relatives that lost their lives. If you listen to the reports that were being made by mainstream media on the day of 9/11, there are numerous references to explosions. Yes.
Yeah, and keep in mind, this is September 11th, too. This isn't a case of your bottle of soda pop exploding on you because it was shaken up. People know exactly what they're talking about with this, and they know the difference between a thud and an explosion. In fact, explosions were captured on at least one video that I know of the firefighters standing around the payphone. Interestingly enough, an HBO documentary cut that part out. They showed the firefighters around the payphone, and then right before the explosion happens, they cut to the next scene. Now, if you're putting out an exciting documentary about this event, it seems like you'd want to keep that part in, but they decided to take it out for some reason. So whenever something happens, if something falls on me, I say it fell on me. If something flew out at me, I say it flew out at me. And if something exploded, I say it exploded. So that is it. I want to thank Larry for his time tonight and for coming up and doing this presentation. And remember, folks, we're going to be back next month. We're going to have an exciting new engineer on to give his presentation. So you aren't going to want to miss it. And if you're not subscribed to our emails to find out when these kinds of presentations are going on, then go to ae911truth.org and make sure you are on our list. But for my part, this is Andy Steele with Larry Cooper, and we'll see you next time, folks. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you, Andy. Okay, bye.